Zara didn't know that the night of her husband's birthday would be the night she died, or at least, the night the world would believe she had, and as she stood barefoot on the deck of their private yacht, the water glittering under the moon like 1,000 whispered promises, she had no idea that every soft kiss, every sweet word, every toast lifted in her name was part of a performance designed not to honor her but to erase her, and she should have seen it, should have noticed the way Adrian had grown colder these past months, how his eyes lingered too long on contracts and not long enough on her, how he'd started calling her the face of the company instead of its heart, but she hadn't, because Zara had loved him, had believed that the boy who once held her hand while her father lay dying in a hospital bed would never become the kind of man who would betray her for a signature and a stockpile. But betrayal doesn't arrive with fanfare, it comes in whispers, in small dismissals, in a midnight walk across the deck where your husband pulls you close under the stars, says he loves you, then pushes you so gently it takes a full second to understand you're falling, and when her body hit the water, cold and brutal, the shock snapped the air from her lungs faster than panic could rise, and the last thing she saw before the waves swallowed her was Adrian's face, calm, unreadable, already walking back into the glow of the celebration as if nothing had happened, and Zara fought to scream, but there was no one to hear, no lifeboat lowered, no alarm sounded, just music echoing across the sea and the burn of salt in her throat, and as she slipped beneath the surface, her arms flailing against the drag of her dress, she didn't think of revenge, or fear, or even death. She thought of her mother's voice years ago, telling her, when they come for your crown, let them take it. Then build another kingdom, and maybe that's why she didn't stop fighting, why she clawed her way back to the surface with a strength she didn't know she still had, her body battered against the waves until the yacht disappeared into the black horizon and all that remained was silence and salt, and she floated there for hours, minutes, years, until the cold stole the pain and left only numbness, and just before her mind let go, she saw a flicker of light in the distance, heard the thrum of an engine, and felt arms pull her from the sea like a second chance being dragged out of a grave, and when she woke up in a small hut with a thatched roof and a stranger's worried eyes peering down at her, she didn't ask where she was, she asked if there was a phone, and when he said no, just radios, just fishing nets and driftwood fires and weathered maps pinned to old wood, she closed her eyes and whispered, good, because she knew then that Adrian had planned it perfectly, had likely filed the report by now, held a press conference with her photo in a silver frame, maybe even cried on camera as he explained how his wife had fallen, how the ocean had taken her, how he would carry her legacy, and what he didn't know, what he could never know, was that Zara, the girl he'd tried to kill, the woman he'd underestimated, had survived. And survival changes a person, not just the body but the bones, the fire, and she knew with terrifying clarity that she couldn't go back yet, couldn't scream her story to the world, not until she understood why, not until she knew every inch of his plan, not until she could take everything he'd built on her name and tear it down without ever having to raise her voice, and as she lay in that bed, staring at the cracked ceiling and listening to the tide slap against the shore, she made herself a promise, not to return as a victim but to rise as something else entirely, and if you've ever watched someone smile as they betrayed you, if you've ever been forced to hold still while someone buried your name, stay with me, because this story doesn't end where he thought it would, it begins here. The first 3 days on the island passed in a haze of fever, salt burns, and half-formed nightmares that bled into memory, the kind where you wake up gasping not because of what you dreamed, but because what you dreamed actually happened, and for Zara, every breath was a reminder that she had survived something she was never meant to, and that survival was not relief, it was responsibility, and the man who had pulled her from the sea, whose name she learned was Luca, didn't ask questions. Didn't press her for details when she gave him a false name and said she'd fallen off a charter boat during a solo vacation, didn't even blink when she winced at the mention of the mainland. He just brought her boiled rice and warm water, wrapped her blisters in strips of cloth soaked in aloe, and built a small fire outside her door every night so the smell of smoke would keep the insects away, and she didn't speak much at first, because her voice still sounded foreign to her own ears, like it belonged to the version of herself that had been swallowed by the ocean, but in the quiet, something else began to settle in, a strange, slow-burning awareness that she was free in a way she'd never been before, because everyone who had ever known Zara Thorne believed she was dead, and that meant she had space to think, to feel, to plan without eyes watching her or headlines crafting false narratives, and by the end of the first week, she was walking again, slow and stiff but determined, and Luca, seeing the shift in her expression, finally asked, "Who did this to you?" And she looked at him for a long time, then said quietly, "Someone who thought I'd never get back up," and that was the last they spoke of it. But from that day on, he began teaching her how to navigate the island, how to fish with his nets, how to track weather patterns with only the shape of the clouds, how to use a radio transmitter with range just long enough to catch passing boats if she ever needed help. But she didn't, not yet, because something about the isolation was giving her a kind of strength that rehab centers and luxury villas never could, and in the stillness of the island, with nothing but her thoughts and the slow churn of the tide, she began to replay everything: Adrian's recent meetings, the business trips that didn't add up, the sudden push for her to sign over minor holdings in the family trust, always masked as estate planning or protecting her time, and she saw it now, all of it. How careful he'd been, how many layers he'd built around her name, how many smiles he'd offered while placing a knife behind her back, and she hated herself for not seeing it sooner, but hate was a distraction and she didn't have the luxury anymore. And one night, after Luca fell asleep beside the dying fire and her son, if she'd ever had one, would have been old enough to ask why the stars looked different over water, she sat by herself with an old map of the outer islands and whispered, "I'm going to take it all back." And the words didn't feel like a wish, they felt like a decision, and from that moment on, she stopped referring to herself as Zara in her thoughts, because Zara had been the woman who trusted blindly, who gave everything and asked for nothing, who loved a man with all the softness in her bones, and the woman standing in her place now wasn't her replacement, she was her rebirth. And by the second week, she asked Luca for a list of nearby coastal towns, pretending she was ready to go home. And when he pointed out a small harbor 3 days east by boat, she said that would do, and that night she counted the cash hidden in the lining of her jacket, a few emergency bills her father had made her keep since college, and it wasn't much, but it would be enough for one ferry, one bus ride, and maybe a second-hand phone if she could find the right store. And when Luca offered to travel with her to the edge of the mainland, she hesitated, then agreed, because she knew she'd need someone to vouch for her identity until she found a way to hide in plain sight again. And on the morning they left, her body still sore but her spine straight, she didn't look back at the hut or the beach or the fire pit. They had saved her, yes, but they belonged to a version of herself who had needed saving, and now, she needed to become the woman who did the saving. And when they reached the harbor 2 nights later and boarded a tiny rust-colored ferry, she didn't flinch at the sound of the engine or the sway of the waves. She stared at the horizon, eyes dry, heart steady, and whispered, "Now we begin, and if you've ever wanted to disappear just long enough to rebuild the life someone tried to take from you, stay close, because what comes next isn't revenge, it's reclamation." The coastal town where she landed was quiet, unassuming, the kind of place where people didn't ask too many questions and faces blurred together in the haze of tourists, fishermen, and tired locals who had seen enough in their lives to mind their own business, and that made it perfect, because Zara didn't need recognition, she needed invisibility, and after thanking Luca with a tight hug and a promise to repay him someday, she watched his boat disappear into the misty horizon, then turned toward the crooked streets and flickering shop signs with nothing but a thin backpack, a pocketful of damp bills, and a name she no longer answered to, and within an hour, she'd found a small hostel run by an older woman who offered her a room with a twin bed and no questions, and it was there, lying on a too-firm mattress with ceiling fan blades creaking above her, that she began stitching the pieces together, not emotionally, not yet, but logistically, because healing could wait. For now, she needed facts, leverage, tools, and the first name that came to her was the one she hadn't spoken aloud in years, Robert Elwyn, her late father's former attorney, the only man who had known the details of her trust fund structure, the one who had drafted the contracts Adrian had charmed his way into but never fully understood, and Zara knew if anyone had buried escape hatches inside that mountain of legal paperwork, it would be Robert, and so the next morning she used a borrowed hostel phone to call his office, disguising her voice just enough, asking for a consultation regarding dormant accounts, and when the receptionist said Robert had retired but his daughter handled the legacy clients now, Zara said, "I'll take the meeting," and 2 days later, she stood outside a narrow glass office 2 towns over with her hair tucked into a scarf and sunglasses covering eyes that had once graced business magazine covers. And the woman who greeted her, Lila Elwyn, was younger than she expected, early 30s, sharp, with coffee in one hand and a laptop in the other, and she smiled without recognition as she said, "You're the appointment about dormant estate protections?" And Zara nodded, "That's right," and as they sat in the private meeting room and Lila pulled out forms, Zara slid a handwritten note across the table that said, "I'm Zara Thorne. I was pushed off a yacht. I am legally dead. Please don't react," and the flicker in Lila's eyes lasted only a second before she nodded slowly, covered the note with her hand, and said aloud, "Okay, let's discuss offshore legacy protocols," and for the next hour they spoke in code, Zara answering only what she had to, Lila skimming the files with growing disbelief and quiet awe, until finally, after a long pause, Lila said, "You know, your father built more safeguards than most people realized," and Zara leaned in, "Can I still access anything?" And Lila gave a small, dangerous smile, enough to disappear completely. And enough to start building something new, and that night, back at the hostel, Zara sat by the window, the hum of scooters echoing below, and made her first official move. She opened a new bank account under a name Lila helped her craft, routed partial funds into it through a secure holding company, and transferred ownership of an old boutique property in her family's name to that same shell entity, which meant she now had an address, an identity, and a base, and it was a start. And over the following weeks she spent her days rebuilding from the outside in, buying clothes that didn't scream wealth but suggested quiet authority, learning how to navigate systems anonymously, researching her husband's current movements through archived investor bulletins and social media breadcrumbs, and what she found made her blood go cold. Adrian hadn't just taken control of her shares, he had begun rewriting the narrative entirely, claiming Zara had been mentally unwell, that she had left letters behind implying suicidal thoughts, and that he had struggled through her loss with dignity and strength, and he'd even launched a charitable foundation in her name, complete with a tearful gala appearance and press statements about continuing her work, and every photo of him, suit pressed, eyes misted, smile soft, made her want to throw something through the glass, but she didn't, because anger was useless without direction, and she had something better now, Lila, a woman who didn't just believe her, but had the tools to help. And the deeper they dug, the more patterns emerged: offshore transfers to shell accounts, falsified invoices, manipulated board votes, and at the center of it all was Adrian, smug and smiling, holding court in a penthouse office Zara had designed, on a floor she had paid to renovate, and Lila looked at her one afternoon and said, "He's not just greedy. He's surgical." This was years in the making, and Zara nodded, her voice flat, "And now it's mine to dismantle. And if you've ever watched someone sell your life like a story they owned, if you've ever wanted to take back every inch of ground that was stolen from you, stay with me, because Zara isn't hiding anymore, she's building a return that no one will see coming." The boutique building Lila helped her reclaim wasn't much from the outside: faded paint, boarded windows, dust that clung to every surface like it was trying to remember who used to live there, but to Zara, it was perfect, not because of what it was but because of what it could become. And as she stepped inside for the first time, keys cold in her hand and sunlight cutting across the floor in long golden stripes, she felt something shift in her chest, not hope exactly, but possibility, and that was enough, because she didn't need a miracle, she needed a base, and this building, hidden on a quiet side street 3 towns away from the city where Adrian was still parading her memory like a trophy, gave her that. And within the week she had hired a discreet renovation crew through Lila's private network, paid in cash under a company name no one would trace back to Thorne Holdings, and each day as the place came back to life, walls repainted, floors sanded, lights rewired, Zara walked through the space with purpose, her steps no longer shaky, her voice more certain, because this wasn't just about survival anymore, this was about creation, about reclaiming space in the world again. And while the front room was shaped into a quiet co-working cafe with large windows and low shelves filled with design books, the back office became her war room, a place where whiteboards filled with names, timelines, and financial trails began to map the rise of her husband's empire and the lies it was built on. And Lila came by every other day with files in sealed envelopes, burner phones, and updates, always careful, always cautious, and Zara had learned to speak in code now, to scrub her emails, to move through town like a shadow, because even though no one had recognized her yet, she knew the moment would come, and she needed to be ready, and what she saw through those reports made her stomach twist. Adrian wasn't just running the company, he was selling it off, piece by piece, to foreign investors, quietly restructuring the brand into something soulless and sleek, erasing everything she and her father had built, and to make it worse, he'd filed for personal control over her intellectual property, including the sustainable development patents she'd co-authored and the environmental grants she'd championed, and the arrogance of it, the sheer audacity, was almost laughable if it didn't make her want to scream. But instead of rage, Zara responded with silence, because silence was where her power now lived, and at night she lay in the studio above the boutique, scrolling through social media accounts that mourned her like a lost queen, hashtags like #RememberZara and tribute pages full of edited videos and magazine clippings, and the comments, though well-meaning, burned. She was so bright, so full of promise. Gone too soon, and she wanted to reply, not gone watching, but instead she turned her attention to the one-weak link Adrian had failed to cover, an unused holding account tied to a trust her father had set up for expansion into humanitarian housing, one Adrian hadn't known about because it had been registered under Zara's mother's maiden name, and through it, Lila helped her route just enough capital to start hiring a small team, a digital strategist who thought she was launching a new startup, a forensic accountant who'd been blacklisted from corporate consulting after exposing a Fortune 500 scandal, and a private investigator named Cole who had once served in military intelligence and didn't blink when she told him she needed a man followed without being touched, and Cole was the one who brought her the first photo, the first crack in Adrian's armor, a snapshot of him with a young woman at an upscale hotel, arm draped around her in a way no grieving widower should display, and it wasn't the affair that mattered, it was the timing. He'd started dating her 2 months after the accident, which would be fine if not for the fact that he'd claimed in legal filings he was still too distraught to make business decisions, and it was exactly the kind of inconsistency she needed to start threading together her quiet comeback. And as the boutique opened softly, branded as a design incubator and creative space, Zara, now operating under the alias Mira Lane, began showing up at industry events under the radar, slipping into gallery launches, pitching Myra's consulting agency to developers who didn't know they were speaking to the woman whose name had once been on the cover of Forbes, and one night, at a private roundtable on sustainable housing, she watched from across the room as one of her old board members bragged about Adrian's visionary pivot, and she smiled, slow and sharp, because they had no idea that the real visionary was back in the game. And if you've ever had to watch someone rewrite your story while the world applauds them for it, you'll understand why Zara wasn't rushing. She was building, quietly, brick by brick, and every silent step she took was one closer to taking everything back. The deeper Zara dug into Adrian's world, the clearer it became that he hadn't simply stolen her company, he'd stolen her entire narrative, piece by piece, reshaping it into something that fit his version of strength, one where he was the broken but brave widower who had taken tragedy and turned it into expansion, and as her private team, now codenamed internally as Project Second Breath, continued tracking everything from investor lists to off-the-record conversations at industry mixers. She began to see just how tightly he had wound himself into her legacy, using her death not just to claim sympathy, but to unlock financial doors she had deliberately kept closed during her lifetime, doors that required media goodwill, public trust, and an unchallenged seat at the table, all of which he now held in her name. And what stung most wasn't the scale of the fraud, it was how easily the world had let it happen, how people who had once sworn loyalty to her now lined up to praise Adrian's resilience, how magazines once eager to interview her about her rise now published anniversary pieces titled Zara Thorne, the empire she left behind, and every time she read another article or watched another interview, she didn't cry, she studied, because every line of flattery, every manipulated quote, every boardroom photo without her face in it was another breadcrumb in the trail she was building back toward public visibility, and by now she had full control of 2 offshore accounts, a reactivated investment arm from her dormant trust, and 3 strategic employees still embedded inside the Thorne Group who believed they were leaking financial data to an investigative journalist, not to the woman they once worked for, and those leaks told her everything. How Adrian had falsified board approval to sign off on a massive asset merger. How he had forged an email from her estate authorizing him to liquidate the research arm she'd spent years developing. How he had purchased 2 luxury penthouses under the shell of a legacy archive, but was living in one and renting out the other under a false corporate name, and the arrogance of it, his belief that he'd buried her too deep to ever face consequences, made her work harder, sleep less, watch more, and one evening, while flipping through a digital folder of internal company call logs flagged by her data analyst, she spotted a name she hadn't seen in years, her estranged brother, Rowan, listed as a blocked caller. Time-stamped only a week before Adrian's last quarterly call with investors, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt, because Rowan had left everything behind 5 years ago after a brutal argument with their father about the company's direction, and Zara hadn't spoken to him since. But if Adrian was blocking his calls now, it meant he was afraid, and fear was useful. So she sent a secure message through an encrypted app she'd once used to arrange press logistics in high-risk countries, and signed it only with, "If you want to talk about what you know, meet me at the old treehouse. Same time. 1 week. Come alone." And then she waited, because Rowan had always been the kind of man who didn't answer directly, but showed up when it mattered, and while the week crawled by she continued building, meeting Lila nightly to adjust their timeline, hiring a film student to begin crafting a digital narrative that could flip the public's perception when she was ready to step into the light again, and most importantly, she began collecting video testimonials from former employees and partners, all disguised. For now, but raw, emotional, truthful, stories of how the company had changed under Adrian, how the culture had shifted from innovation to fear, how projects were cancelled, ethics ignored, voices silenced, and by the time the week ended and she drove out to the remote woods where her family once kept a private cabin, she wasn't hoping, she was preparing. And when she saw a familiar figure leaning against the frame of the old treehouse stairs, arms crossed, beard longer, eyes older, but still him. Her breath hitched, and he looked at her and said, "You were always better at surviving than me," and she walked forward and replied, "And you were always better at disappearing," and he pulled her into a hug that felt like home and history and forgiveness, and when they finally sat down inside the treehouse, she told him everything, every second in the water, every lie in Adrian's plan, every move she'd made since, and when she was done, he didn't pity her, didn't panic, he said, "I have emails. Proof. Dad made me archive everything before I left. Adrian tried to buy my silence last year. I refused. Now I think he's trying to erase me altogether," and Zara leaned forward, voice calm but fierce, "Then we burn it down together," and for the first time since she was pushed into the sea, she felt something almost like joy, not because justice had been served, but because now, with Rowan beside her, the story wasn't just hers to tell anymore, it was theirs to end. Rowan's arrival changed everything, not just strategically but emotionally, because having someone who knew the shape of her story before it twisted, someone who had seen her as more than a brand or an empire or a headline, grounded her in a way that all the documents and wire transfers never could, and over the following days, the old treehouse became more than a nostalgic memory, it became their command post, layered with maps, scribbled timelines, burner laptops, and coded whiteboards that tracked every move Adrian made in the press, in court, in private meetings where he still believed the walls couldn't talk, and while Lila handled the legal scaffolding behind the scenes and Cole followed Adrian's every public movement, Zara and Rowan divided the emotional front. She reached out to the people Adrian had discarded, the developers and partners and employees who had once held her confidence and now watched from the sidelines with regret, while Rowan took point on reactivating their father's old legal contacts, buried deep in firms that didn't advertise loyalty but practiced it religiously, and slowly, the once scattered network of allies began to come alive again, voices returning with hesitant belief, files sliding through encrypted inboxes, anonymous letters of support appearing at Zara's boutique doorstep, all of them feeding into a growing reservoir of quiet, mounting truth. And as the threads tightened, Zara knew it was almost time, but before she could return publicly, she needed one last piece, proof that Adrian hadn't just stolen money or titles, but had attempted murder, and for that, she needed someone who had been on that yacht the night she was pushed overboard, and the only name she remembered from the staff manifest was a deckhand named Ethan, barely 21, always avoiding eye contact, paid in cash, and likely long gone by now. But Cole tracked him down in a rundown apartment 2 states over, and when Zara called him using her disguised number and a rehearsed voice, he froze after 5 words, then whispered, "I thought you were dead," and she replied, "So did everyone else," and after a long pause, he agreed to meet, not for money, not for leverage, but because he hadn't slept since that night, and when they sat across from each other at a dim cafe booth at midnight, Zara with her hood up and Ethan with his hands shaking, he told her everything. How Adrian had ordered all cameras off at midnight for privacy, how he had watched from a distance as Adrian pulled her toward the railing and whispered something before pushing her, how he had frozen, too afraid to intervene, then been paid off the next morning and told to disappear, and Zara didn't rage, didn't accuse, she just took his hand and said, "You're not the villain here. But you can help stop him now," and Ethan agreed to record a testimony, full face, no blur, no disguise, and when Lila saw it, she said softly, "This is the final nail," and from that moment forward, every piece of the plan shifted into motion. The interviews lined up in secret, the files organized for public release, the press coordinated through a journalist who owed Rowan his career, and as the day approached, Zara stood in front of a mirror for the first time in months, no disguise, no scarf, no sunglasses, and looked at the woman staring back, not fragile, not ruined, but sharpened, like glass shaped by waves, and David's tailored jackets had been replaced by her own structured silhouette, elegant but unflinching, and when she walked into the boutique that morning and stood before her team, they didn't see a ghost, they saw a leader, and she said quietly, "It's time," and at 10 a.m., the first anonymous leaks hit the inboxes of 2 major financial watchdogs, followed by Ethan's video posted on a hidden YouTube channel, followed by screenshots of forged documents and manipulated contracts, all timed precisely with Zara's scheduled return to the city under her real name, passport reissued, death certificate formally challenged by Lila's legal motion, and when she stepped into the press room that afternoon, cameras flashing, reporters gasping, no one could look away, not because she was beautiful, not because she was back, but because she was undeniable, and she stepped up to the mic, took a breath, and said, "My name is Zara Thorne. I am not dead. I was never lost. I was nearly murdered by the man who now sits at the head of my company," and the room erupted, not with chaos, but with a rising heat that only truth can ignite, and if you've ever dreamed of watching the people who buried you be forced to listen while you speak, stay here, because Zara is no longer planning her return. She's living it. The moment the press conference ended, Zara didn't wait for applause or questions. She walked off the stage with the same quiet control she'd carried through every secret meeting, every hidden step of her return, and outside the venue, the street was already crowded with flashing lights, confused reporters, live streams running, and gasps of disbelief from passers-by who had only moments ago believed they were looking at a woman who drowned. And as she stepped into the black sedan waiting at the curb, Lila already inside feeding updates through her phone, the world began to split into 2, those who had profited from Zara's supposed death, and those who now realized they were complicit in a lie too big to ignore, and within the hour, her face was everywhere, news banners flashing Zara Thorne returns from the dead, husband implicated in fraud and attempted murder, while financial blogs dissected the leaked documents and social media spun into frenzy, her name trending in every major country within 4 hours, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Adrian was still silent, no statements, no responses, not even a public appearance, and Zara knew why, because silence was the only card he had left to play, and that night, as she sat with Rowan in the loft above the boutique, news anchors looping the footage of her speech over and over, she whispered, "He'll come for me next, not legally, personally," and Rowan nodded, "Then we stay 2 moves ahead," and they did, because by morning, Adrian's crisis management team released a statement calling her return unexpected and emotionally complex, painting her as possibly unstable, and hinting that perhaps she had faked her death after all, that trauma had led to delusion, and Zara, watching him weaponize her survival, felt a calm, cold clarity rise inside her, and she replied not with another press conference, but with evidence, releasing a time-stamped audio recording of Adrian's bribery attempt to Ethan, followed by internal emails that clearly outlined a plan to transition Zara's legacy into something more scalable, and the emails, laced with smug language and phrases like, "We've passed the public mourning threshold," hit harder than any headline, and suddenly those who had once defended Adrian began pulling back, investors canceling appearances, old friends issuing neutral statements, and the first board member resigned that same afternoon, citing moral conflict. And still, Zara didn't stop, because it wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about restoring the truth and setting a precedent, because women like her didn't get second chances often, and she wasn't going to waste it. And by the third day, Adrian's attorney requested a private meeting, offering to discuss resolution options, but Zara refused. She wanted everything out in the open, wanted depositions, subpoenas, courtrooms, transcripts. And when Lila asked her if she was ready for the emotional toll, Zara answered, "I drowned and came back. I'm ready for anything." And what surprised her most wasn't the speed with which the empire began to crack, but the silence of the people who had once praised Adrian to her face, the same executives and advisors who had called her difficult, emotional, too idealistic, now nowhere to be found. And it was in that silence that she found power, because as the noise around her grew louder, she remained steady, showing up to hearings with her hair pulled back and her eyes sharp, answering questions with brutal clarity, never flinching as her lawyers outlined the financial theft, the emotional abuse, the attempted murder disguised as an accident. And Adrian, for all his calculated charm, began to unravel, his voice shaking under cross-examination, his stories contradicting, his documents falling apart. And at night, Zara didn't celebrate. She worked, wrote, and when she needed to breathe, she sat with her son's old stuffed bear in her hands, the one she'd kept in a locked drawer since he passed, and whispered, "I hope I'm making you proud." And one evening, Lila placed a folder in front of her with a quiet kind of gravity, and inside was the final document, the one confirming full reinstatement of her legal identity, business rights, and title as CEO of Thorne Holdings. And Zara didn't cry when she signed it, didn't even smile. She just exhaled and said, "Now let's turn this company into something real again." And if you've ever been told you were too soft to lead, too emotional to rebuild, too broken to rise, watch closely, because Zara isn't done reclaiming her story. She's rewriting the rules. Taking back the company didn't feel like a victory parade. It felt like stepping into a burned-out building and deciding to live in it anyway, to strip the charred walls down with her own hands and start building again from the bones, because the Thorne Holdings Zara returned to wasn't the same one she had left. It had been hollowed out by greed, reshaped in Adrian's image, bloated with overpriced acquisitions and corporate partnerships that looked impressive on paper but bled integrity at every seam. And as she sat in the glass-walled boardroom for the first time since her death certificate had been issued, the seats filled with faces that had once toasted her and then toasted her memory, she didn't rage, didn't scream. She spoke, clear and quiet, telling them what was coming: audits, resignations, rebranding, and a full-scale pivot from status chasing to substance. And when one of the senior board members muttered that such drastic changes might destabilize investor confidence, she met his eyes and said, "What destabilized this company was believing you could steal it from the woman who built it and bury her with a smile." And no one spoke after that, and over the weeks that followed, Zara moved with calm intensity, restructuring departments, reactivating her sustainable initiatives, reinstating the ethics division Adrian had dismantled, and inviting back the people who had once believed in the mission before it had been twisted by ambition. And slowly, the company began to breathe again, not with flash or headlines, but with purpose. And alongside it, Zara quietly launched a new foundation in her son's name, focused on grief support and advocacy for women who had survived near-fatal betrayal. And the first letters she received from women across the country, some handwritten, others sent through the secure inbox Lila built, left her breathless, because they weren't just thank you notes, they were echoes, filled with stories of husbands who gaslit and erased, of mothers who had no proof but knew something wasn't right, of daughters hiding bruises under sweaters while still believing love should hurt. And reading them lit something in her deeper than anger ever had: conviction. And she poured that conviction into her days, meeting with lawmakers, creating scholarships, building a survivor-led council inside the company that reported directly to her. And all the while, the lawsuit against Adrian progressed like slow poison. each court date stripping more of his defenses away, each deposition revealing new layers of manipulation, and even though the criminal case for attempted murder was still waiting on a final hearing, Zara didn't wait to feel vindicated. She felt whole already, not because justice had been delivered, but because she'd reclaimed every part of herself he had tried to erase. And one afternoon, while walking through the new innovation wing named after her mother, she passed a group of interns whispering in the hallway, and one of them looked up and said, "Miss Thorne, I just want to say thank you for everything," and Zara paused, smiled softly, and replied, "No need to thank me. Just keep building something that matters." And that night, she stood on the rooftop garden Adrian once used for showy investor dinners, now filled with wildflowers and quiet benches, and watched the city lights blink like stars in reverse. And when Rowan came up beside her, hands tucked into his jacket, he said, "You didn't just survive him. You outgrew him," and she nodded slowly. "He tried to kill me with control. I came back with clarity," and there, in that soft dusk, she made a final decision, not to destroy Adrian publicly in a blaze of press and soundbites, but to let the system handle him while she moved on. And when his sentencing finally came weeks later, 7 years for corporate fraud, with the attempted murder trial still pending due to new evidence from Ethan, Zara didn't attend the hearing, didn't watch the news coverage, didn't say a word. She spent that day visiting the shelter she helped fund, sitting with a young girl who had run from home with bruises under her sleeves, and she held her hand and said, "You're not broken. You're beginning." And later that night, when she returned home to the apartment she'd bought under her name, her walls lined with photos of the people she'd helped, she looked in the mirror and saw not the woman who'd been pushed into the sea, but the one who had risen from it. And if you've ever believed that silence meant defeat, that disappearing meant loss, Zara Thorne is here to remind you, survival is just the start. What you build after it is everything. There was a moment, quiet, unremarkable on the outside, when Zara realized she no longer felt the weight of what Adrian had done sitting on her chest when she woke up, no longer checked the locks twice at night or looked over her shoulder when walking into meetings. And it wasn't because justice had fully arrived or because the world had suddenly become fair, but because somewhere between the late-night strategy calls and the whispered stories of survivors who now called her a lighthouse, she had learned how to live without waiting for the next betrayal. And that kind of peace was louder than applause, more valuable than any vindication, and it showed in everything, from the way she wore her hair now, loose and slightly windblown, to the way she laughed when Rowan teased her about how serious she used to be, to the way her staff stopped tensing around her and started relaxing, knowing she wasn't a figurehead in a portrait. They were following someone real, and it was on one of those rare, free evenings, curled up with a blanket and a glass of wine in her reading nook, that Zara opened her journal for the first time in months, flipping past old pages filled with grief and planning and rage, and found a blank space where she wrote, slowly and without hesitation, "I am not who I was when he tried to erase me, and that is the greatest revenge." And beneath it, she added a single line, "I forgive myself for loving him." And it wasn't a dramatic breakthrough, just a soft breath of release. The kind that makes room for something new to grow. And in the weeks that followed, that something new took root quietly, starting with a man named Elias, a trauma counselor who had volunteered with one of her new youth programs and who didn't flinch when he recognized her but didn't treat her like a headline either. And their first real conversation happened over spilled coffee and mismatched volunteer t-shirts, where he'd asked, "Do people ever stop asking you what it felt like to die?" And she'd laughed, not bitter, just honest, and said, "I wish more people asked what it felt like to come back." And something about the way he didn't rush to fill the silence afterward made her want to speak again, and so she did, over the course of several quiet weeks where they co-led grief groups, built emergency resource kits, and eventually shared takeout on a bench under the flickering streetlights near the new center. And she liked that he never asked about Adrian, never needed her story to explain why she moved slowly in crowded rooms or why she sometimes left events early when the lights got too bright. And one night, after a long planning session for an upcoming retreat, he said, "You know, you've created something that'll outlive you." And she looked up, eyes tired but steady, and replied, "Then it was all worth surviving for." And when he reached over, just briefly brushing her hand, she didn't flinch, not because the past was gone, but because the present was finally safe. Enough to reach for, and still, even as that soft, unfamiliar warmth began to grow in her, Zara didn't rush it, didn't label it, just let it unfold the same way she had rebuilt herself, quietly, honestly, with space for breath and choice. And on the night of the first official gala under the new Thorne Foundation name, she stood backstage in a sleek black dress that was elegant but didn't scream wealth, her speech cards in her hand, and Rowan at her side pretending not to get emotional as he said, "Dad would have hated this whole thing, and loved every second of it," and she smiled, kissed his cheek, and stepped into the light not as someone returning, but as someone who had been here all along, just waiting to be seen again. And when the applause came, it didn't feel like noise, it felt like recognition, like the world finally catching up to the truth of her story. And afterward, as the guests mingled and the cameras stopped rolling, Elias found her near the back exit, where the air was cool and the sky full of stars, and said softly, "You looked like yourself up there," and she turned to him, heart open but unguarded, and said, "That's the only person I want to be now, and if you've ever thought healing was quiet, let Zara show you otherwise, because sometimes, the softest parts of the story are where the power finally begins." Legacy had always been a word other people used when talking about Zara, journalists, board members, family friends, but now, for the first time, it was a word she began using herself, not in speeches or interviews, but in the quiet, practical way that real builders think. Where does this go when I'm gone? Who will carry it forward? And she didn't mean her company or the foundation or even her public story, she meant the space she had carved in the world for truth, for healing, for women who needed to know that survival wasn't shameful, that it didn't have to be hidden, and that real power came from stepping back into your life on your own terms. And the months that followed the gala felt like both a beginning and a soft ending, not because anything was over, but because the fight had changed shape. It wasn't about proving herself anymore or burning Adrian's name from the walls of her company, it was about expansion, education, ripple effects, and she leaned into that with the same precision and intensity that had once helped her run billion-dollar product launches, now channeled into policy work, mentorship programs, international alliances that connected silent survivors across borders. And it was in the middle of all this travel, strategy, storytelling, that she began to feel something else, stillness, not the paralyzing kind that came after trauma, but the restful kind that grows when you've finally stopped running. And it showed in how she woke up, no longer gasping or braced for bad news, but stretching slowly, making tea, reading letters at the kitchen counter with bare feet on cold tile. And it showed in how she spoke to Elias, too, with fewer guarded pauses, more unfiltered joy. And one evening, after they finished dinner on her balcony and watched the city lights flicker to life, he turned to her and said, "You talk like someone who's finally living in her own skin," and she smiled, leaning into him, "That's because I finally believe I deserve to." And he didn't respond with a compliment or some poetic line, he just kissed her, soft and steady, and for the first time in her life, a kiss didn't feel like a promise she had to prove herself worthy of, it just felt like peace. And the next morning, she found an envelope waiting on her desk, no return address, just her name written in handwriting she hadn't seen in years. And when she opened it, she found a letter from Ethan, the deckhand who'd testified against Adrian, telling her that he'd started working at a youth sailing camp, that he talked about her sometimes when kids asked why he believed in second chances, and he ended it with, "You didn't just save your life. You made mine count again." And she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her journal, right next to the pages where she used to write her fears, her plans, her grief, and now, her gratitude. And still, the world didn't forget her, the headlines still came, the think pieces, the interviews, but they didn't define her anymore, not because they weren't powerful, but because her own voice had become louder in her own life. And when she eventually took a weekend off, her first real break in almost 2 years, she didn't go to a luxury resort or hide behind tinted windows, she went to Luca's island, the one where she'd washed ashore, this time not broken or bleeding or lost, but standing tall with a small duffel, her heart steady, her eyes open. And when Luca saw her, he didn't speak right away, just nodded, grinned, and said, "You brought the storm with you last time. Today, it looks like calm." And they sat under the same thatched roof, now repaired, drank strong tea by the water, and watched the sky melt into gold. And Zara said, "I wanted to come back before the end," and Luca raised a brow, and she smiled, no, not death. Just, the end of the beginning, and they both laughed, because that's how full circles work. They don't feel like endings, they feel like openings, and if you've ever thought your past would always own the loudest part of you, let Zara remind you, you get to rewrite the ending, even if you have to do it slowly, word by word, breath by breath. Until one day you wake up and realize the life you feared was gone has finally become the one you were always meant to live. It took returning to the city after that weekend on the island for Zara to realize just how much lighter she'd become, not in body, but in the way she moved through space, no longer weighed down by constant calculation, no longer scanning every room for exits or pauses in conversation where someone might mention Adrian's name, and when she walked back into the Thorne Foundation offices that Monday morning, she wasn't thinking about headlines or strategy, she was thinking about planting sunflowers. On the building's south side, because someone on the youth advisory board had mentioned how their mother used to grow them, and Zara thought, that's what we're doing now, we're growing things again, and the fact that she could think that without bitterness, without even flinching, meant something was healing for real, and over the next several weeks she leaned even deeper into that momentum, holding space not just for others, but for herself too. Longer evenings without her phone, dinner with Elias where they talked about ordinary things like favorite street vendors and how he used to sneak into museums as a kid, and one night, curled up beside him on the couch, he looked at her with that patient steadiness she was still learning to receive and asked, "Do you ever feel like it's really over?" And she didn't lie, she said, "Not yet," and he nodded like he already knew the rest, because it wasn't the court cases or the asset returns or the foundation that would bring the real end, it was the day she could look at the whole story, even the parts where she had been most afraid, and not feel like she was still standing inside them, and that day came more quietly than she expected, on a Thursday morning, crisp and bright, when Rowan forwarded her a final court transcript, Adrian's sentencing in the fraud case upheld on appeal, his bail request denied, and a civil case filed against him by another former employee who had found the courage to speak out after hearing Zara's story. And instead of feeling triumphant, she felt, still, not numb, not hollow, just done, and she replied simply, "Thank you." No need to forward anything else, and closed the email with a finality that didn't sting, and that afternoon, she took a walk through the original Thorne campus, the one her father had built in the city's quieter edge before the skyscrapers came, and she paused by the oak tree where they used to sit on lunch breaks, and she let herself cry, not because she was sad, but because she'd finally made it through the fire without dragging its smoke into every room, and later that evening, when she got home, she found a small package waiting outside her door, no return label, just her name written in familiar block letters, and inside was a flash drive, a handwritten note that read, "For whatever closure is worth," and she didn't need to ask who it was from, Ethan again, this time sending a recovered security log from the yacht, one that had been wiped during the investigation. And when she played it, grainy, time-stamped, it showed the moment, blurry but undeniable, Adrian walking her toward the rail, stopping, then pushing, and even though she'd lived that moment in memory 1,000 times, watching it was different, harder in some ways, but also, freeing, because now there was no doubt, no lingering part of her mind trying to rationalize or reshape what happened, and she took a deep breath and said aloud, to no one but herself, "He did it. I survived." He failed, and then she deleted the video, not because it wasn't valuable, but because she no longer needed it to believe herself, and that night, Elias came over with takeout and a bottle of wine, and when she opened the door, still in her hoodie, still raw from what she'd just seen, he asked nothing, just held out the bag and said, "I thought you might want pad thai in silence," and they ate on the floor, music playing low, and when she finally told him about the footage, he nodded and said, "You didn't need the proof. You were the proof," and she leaned into him, her head on his chest, and said, "I think this is the first time I've ever felt free," and he smiled into her hair, "Then let's build the rest from here," and if you've ever wondered what healing sounds like, it's not always applause or closure or grand final words. Sometimes it's just the quiet click of a door closing behind you, for good. There was something sacred in the ordinary now, something that Zara clung to in ways she never could before, the first sip of coffee in the morning when the building was still quiet, the feel of warm socks on the tile floor, the weight of Elias's hand finding hers under the table during long planning meetings, not because it was performative or comforting, but because it had simply become habit, and that, more than anything, was what freedom looked like to her now, not escape, not applause, but consistency, the slow rhythm of a life not dictated by trauma or defense, and in that rhythm she found herself blooming again, not in public, not for headlines, but in the small spaces she once feared she'd lost, her own laugh echoing from the balcony as Rowan made fun of her playlist, a teenager at the shelter pulling her aside to say, "I didn't think someone like you would understand someone like me," and Zara replying, "I didn't think someone like me would survive someone like him," and the quiet gratitude that followed, spoken not in words but in presence, and as the foundation grew, opening its 4th location, expanding its legal aid programs, partnering with trauma-informed design teams to create shelters that felt like home, Zara stayed rooted, no longer needing to be everywhere at once, no longer afraid that if she slowed down, something would unravel, because she trusted the hands now holding the vision beside her, people like Lila and Rowan and dozens of staff who had once come to her with trembling hands and now stood tall in their own power, and it was at one of their internal team retreats, nothing glamorous, just a long weekend at a quiet lakeside lodge, that Zara finally let go of the last question she'd carried like a shard under the skin: what if he hadn't pushed me? And instead of spiraling, she sat by the fire with Elias one evening, soft guitar playing in the background, and said it out loud, "I used to think I wanted answers, but I think I just wanted to know if I ever really mattered to him," and Elias didn't offer platitudes, didn't try to fix it, he just looked at her, steady and full of love, and said, "You matter. The rest doesn't," and she nodded, because the truth was, that was the only answer she'd ever needed, and in the quiet of that night, she took out her phone and deleted the last anonymous alert still tracking Adrian's status, because she no longer needed updates on the man who once tried to erase her. She had built a world where he didn't exist, and that was power she didn't need to weaponize to feel, and when she returned home that week, there was a letter waiting from the governor's office, an invitation to sit on a new National Advisory Board on Domestic Justice Reform, and for a moment, she just stared at it, not because she was surprised, but because it confirmed what she had known deep down for some time now, that her story had stopped being about what she had lost, and had become about what she was giving. And when she called Elias to tell him, laughing, stunned, he simply said, "They're finally catching up to who you've been this whole time," and later that night, as she packed her bag for the trip to Washington, she paused, pulled out the old necklace her mother had given her at 18, a delicate gold chain she hadn't worn in years, and clasped it around her neck, looking in the mirror not to adjust her appearance, but to hold her own gaze, and she whispered, "You made it," and she didn't mean the version of herself staring back, she meant the girl who had once floated alone in the dark, who had counted stars instead of hope, who had chosen to live when everything told her to give up. And if you've ever wondered what happens after the storm clears, this is it, not a fairy tale, not a headline comeback, but a life fully lived, on your own terms, with your own voice, surrounded by people who don't need you to shrink to love you, and this is where Zara now lived, among sunrises that didn't ask her to prove her worth, only to show up and begin again. The flight to Washington felt different from every other trip she'd taken before, not because it was her first time on a plane since the night Adrian had tried to kill her, though that fact lingered in the back of her mind like a shadow she had learned not to fear, but because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't traveling to defend herself or reclaim something, she was going to give, to shape, to build beyond her own story. And as the city came into view beneath the clouds, cold and sharp with early winter light, Zara looked out the window and whispered, "Let's do this," not as a promise, but as a truth she no longer needed to rehearse, and when she arrived at the hotel, greeted by aides and foundation reps and politicians who suddenly looked at her not as a headline or a tragedy but as a peer, she didn't feel out of place, didn't feel like she needed to wear her scars like armor, she simply walked in with her head high, her voice calm, and her eyes sharper than ever, and during the first roundtable meeting, as senators and CEOs discussed systemic failure with language so sanitized it nearly erased the reality, Zara spoke up, steady and direct, and said, "We keep using the word recovery like it's a finish line. For a lot of women, recovery is just the first time they're allowed to breathe without apology," and the room went quiet, not because they were stunned, but because they were finally listening, and afterward, a junior policy advisor followed her into the hallway and said, "That's the first time I've ever heard someone say it like it is," and Zara smiled, tucked her notes into her bag and said, "Then we say it louder next time," and that night, she returned to her hotel room, slipped off her heels, opened her laptop, and sent an update to the team back home, not about the optics, but about what came next: funding pushes for state-level reforms, emergency grants for survivor-led startups, a media campaign that showed what survival looked like outside courtrooms and tabloid headlines, and when she signed off, she added one sentence she hadn't written in a long time: "I believe in the future we're building." And it wasn't just a hope anymore, it was happening, and when she flew home too. Days later, tired but lit from within, Elias met her at the airport, holding a small bouquet of sunflowers wrapped in newspaper, and when she laughed and said, "You really brought flowers to arrivals like it's a movie?" he shrugged and said, "You keep living like one," and the way he kissed her, unrushed, grounded, without the weight of needing to fix her, reminded her again that love didn't have to be a prize you earned by surviving. It could just be a place you returned to, and over the next few weeks, as the foundation expanded and new team members arrived and the national campaign rolled out, Zara began noticing something she hadn't expected: more young women, more letters, more emails, not from survivors this time, but from changemakers, girls in law school quoting her speeches, teenagers writing essays titled "Why Zara Thorne Matters," and it wasn't ego that moved her, it was impact, because she knew what it felt like to look for a voice like hers and find only silence, and now, she was determined to leave the door open behind her so others wouldn't have to walk through fire alone. And as the year closed out and the gala invitations came in and the press began circling again, this time offering awards, covers, features, Zara said no more often than she said yes, not because she was hiding, but because she had finally learned the difference between being visible and being valued, and when she did accept an award, standing on a stage dressed in quiet elegance, she didn't speak about Adrian, didn't mention the trial or the betrayal. She said, "I'm here because I stopped trying to prove I deserve to be," and that line made its way into 1,000 tweets, 100 articles, and more importantly, into the notebook of a girl in the third row who wiped her tears and mouthed "thank you," and afterward, when Elias wrapped his coat around her shoulders as they walked through the cold night, she said, "I think this might be the happiest I've ever been," and he replied, "That's because you're finally allowed to just be." And if you've ever wondered what it looks like when someone turns pain into purpose, when a woman rises not just from what broke her but toward what heals others, this is it. Not perfection, not fame, but the quiet, unstoppable momentum of someone who chose to keep going. The invitation came on thick ivory paper, embossed and formal, signed by the board of Thorne International and the event's new philanthropic partners, a legacy tribute plan to honor Zara's father, his original work in sustainability, and the generational arc of the company since his passing. And while the gesture was noble on the surface, Zara knew exactly what it represented: closure, public and polished, a way for the business world to place a bow on her family's story, to celebrate its survival without ever naming the betrayal that almost ended it. And she stared at the card for a long time before placing it on her desk, not out of anger, but out of consideration, because for years she had lived for moments like these: the high-gloss gatherings, the speeches, the press. But now, what mattered more was whether the space being offered was real, whether it would let her stand not as a symbol but as a full person. And a week later, she RSVP'd yes, not to be seen, but to be complete. Because there was still one thing she hadn't done, not for the world, but for herself, and that was to tell the truth in the very place where her silence had once been curated. And the event was held on a floating terrace just off the coast, anchored near the same marina where her yacht had once sailed out with a birthday cake and never returned with her. And as she stepped off the small transfer boat, wind catching the edge of her navy gown, she felt the weight of memory press against her ribs. Not heavy, just present, and Elias stood beside her in a simple suit, no tie, hands gentle on her back as he asked, "Do you want to do this?" And she nodded without pause, "Yes. I need to," and inside, the room buzzed with wealth and admiration, her name whispered in reverence now, no longer scandal or sorrow but respect. And as she moved through the crowd, gracious and quiet, she saw the photos lined along the walls, her father shaking hands at groundbreaking ceremonies, her own younger self grinning beside a wind farm ribbon cutting, Adrian in none of them, and that absence was the truest justice of all. And when it was time for her to speak, they handed her the mic. With practiced elegance, expecting perhaps a tribute to legacy, a quote about resilience, but what they got instead was Zara looking out over the water and saying, "The first time I came out here, I almost didn't come back." Not metaphorically. Literally. And it took nearly dying to understand how easily the world turns pain into mythology when a woman doesn't survive to correct it, and the room went still, the clinking of glasses fading, and she continued, not angry, not performative, just clear, "This company has built things that matter." But it also allowed a man to rewrite history while I was still underwater. It stood by silently while my name became a brand, not a voice. And today, I'm reclaiming the voice, and she didn't go into details, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't have to, and when she ended with, "The future of this legacy isn't mine alone. It belongs to every woman who's ever been told she was too emotional to lead, too fragile to rebuild, too broken to begin again. We're not your cautionary tales. We're your blueprint." The applause didn't erupt, it rose slowly, like a tide, and when it washed over her, it felt clean, not indulgent, not hollow, and later, as she stood on the upper deck watching the waves crash softly beneath the moonlight, she reached into her bag and pulled out the last thing she'd kept from that night, a gold pin Adrian had given her before the yacht party, meant to symbolize forever, and without hesitation, she let it slip from her fingers into the sea, not as revenge, but as release, and Elias came to her side, slipped his arm around her waist and said nothing, because some moments don't need commentary, they just need witnesses, and if you've ever waited years to feel whole again, to write the final chapter on your own terms, to speak the truth in the very room where your silence was once demanded, this is it, this is how it ends, not with fury, not with vengeance, but with the steady, unmistakable peace of someone who survived, and then chose to lead. It had been nearly 3 years since Zara had been thrown into the sea, since the water had closed over her head like a grave and the world had moved on without her, and yet standing now on the edge of that same ocean, dressed in quiet simplicity with her feet in the sand and the wind nodding her hair, she didn't feel like someone haunted, she felt like someone whole, and the reason she was here wasn't symbolic, wasn't orchestrated for cameras or campaigns, it was personal, chosen, because healing doesn't happen on command, it happens when you're ready, and today, she was, and she'd brought only a few people with her, Rowan, Elias, Lila, and the newest group of survivor leaders from her foundation, not because they needed to see where it began, but because she needed to show herself where it ended. And they stood in a soft semicircle behind her as she faced the water with a journal in one hand and a folded letter in the other, the same one she'd written months ago but never mailed. Addressed to the version of herself that once believed survival was enough, and she read it aloud, not loudly, but with clarity, the words steady, "You didn't know it then, but the ocean wasn't the end of you. It was the beginning. And everything that came after, the pain, the silence, the rebuilding, wasn't punishment. It was birth. You lost everything that night. And you found yourself," and when she finished, she folded the letter and placed it in a small glass bottle, sealing it before wading out into the water just deep enough to feel the tide pull against her legs, and she let it go, not as a gesture, but as an offering, not for closure, but for continuation, because the truth was she would carry that night with her forever, but now, it didn't carry her, and as she turned back toward the shore, the people she loved waiting there, smiling, not with pity, not with pride, just presence, she felt something click into place, not like a revelation, but like a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, and Elias reached for her hand, grounding her with a touch that had never once asked her to be anyone other than herself, and Rowan, half smiling through his usual sarcasm, said, "You done almost dying now?" And Zara laughed, deep and unguarded, "For today." And they walked back to the beach house she'd built nearby, designed not with extravagance but with intention, wide windows, open doors, soft places to land, and as the sun set in deep strokes of pink and orange, the group gathered for one last dinner, barefoot and relaxed, voices overlapping with stories and new beginnings, and at the center of it all was Zara, not performing, not leading, just living, and when the night grew quiet and the stars bloomed across the sky, she stepped outside alone for a moment, sat on the steps, and whispered, "You did it." Not just the comeback. The staying, and that, more than the empire, more than the headlines, was what mattered. She had stayed, when it would have been easier to disappear. She had chosen to return, to rebuild, to rise in a world that had already written her ending for her, and now, she had written her own. And if you've ever felt like you were drowning in someone else's story, let Zara Thorne remind you, there's always another page waiting. One only you can write. That I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.